So I'm going to pinch hit for our chairman and CEO, Mr. Michael Sweatman, and welcome all of you to our fourth 2016 seminar. We're delighted to have everybody here, and we think that, again, today we have a very, very interesting program. Our first seminar this year, as you know, talked about the Sunni and the Shiite divide, something, of course, that's been around since a million years, I think, but not quite, but a long, long time. Our second seminar, which was held over at in Washington, had to do with trying to untangle the Russian challenge and the Russians puzzle, as we called it. And then we also, of course, met at the National Press Club earlier last month and on our 18th annual International Cooperation in Combating Terrorism. So we did that, and of course now we're here today to talk about a very, very crucial challenge for many of our countries around the world, and that's the problem we have with the refugee crisis and covering both the humanitarian and the security interests. And I would add that it's more than just that. It's an economic challenge for many of the border countries. It's a very, very difficult concept and a very, very difficult program to carry out. And there are, of course, many, many different challenges within that. So we have a very distinguished group of speakers here today. I'm going to let Lord Yonah Alexander introduce all those people, since he's so good at that. But again, I want to welcome you, and when we open it up for questions, and nobody ever listens to me, but please ask a question, not make a speech. You know, that drives me nuts. Not that you have to pay attention to me anyway, because I only, if we get a chance for more people, they ask more questions. But for some reason, we have a long record of having questions that sound more like speeches and positions and agendas, and that's okay in certain forums, but it doesn't let everybody else play in our seminar. So with that, Yonah. That's a picture for you. Oh, okay, go ahead. Oh, yeah.
First, would you kindly turn off the cell phones? Thank you. Thank you very much, General, for your opening remarks. I would like to introduce first our panel. First, Mark Krikorian, right here to my left. Many of you know he's the executive director of the Center for Immigration Studies, and he participated at our events in the past, and I'm sure he keeps himself very, very busy, and whether he presents an American perspective, or at least as American, this would be very useful. We're waiting for our other panelists. Olga Ehrlicher is here. Oh, wonderful. Oh, okay, great. She's the senior advisor and director of the Russia and the Eurasia program at CSIS. So get something to eat before you faint. But at any rate, you're going to be next. Unfortunately, Robert McKenzie, who is a fellow at the Brookings Institution, had to actually postpone his participation because of some family situation. I regret that, but I'm very glad that we do have Barko Kürman from the Turkish embassy, who is the counselor at the embassy, and she was gracious to come and to also make a brief presentation, particularly in light of the recent EU-Turkish negotiations on the refugee issues. And finally, we have Evren Stein, a former deputy secretary at the OAS, also advisor to the Secretary General on Defense, and he worked for many years on the security issues related to the OAS and other regions, and then we'll try to develop a discussion. As always, we welcome our audience, academics, professionals, and the diplomatic community as well, and we're grateful to them for their participation and insights. Now, I want to move on very quickly, just not speeches, general, but a few footnotes, as we say. Number one, if we can move on right here. I'm sure that many of you recognize that picture on my left, the Syrian boy body on the Turkish beach, Ellen Kurdi. As you know, that I think attracted a great deal of attention. The 3-year-old who tried to reach, obviously, Europe, and that's what happened. I think this particular picture does capture the magnitude of the humanitarian crisis. On the left, I'm sure that all of you, if not most of you, would think that this is one of the boats that are related to the refugee, I think, exodus, if you will, to Europe. But generally, if I may be personal, I cannot resist from reporting to you that on this boat, my wife was a refugee going back to 1946, when her family, those who survived the Second World War, they escaped from Europe to Palestine, that was under the control at that time of the British. This particular boat supposed to have about 800 people, but actually there were 1,600 people with over 200 children, old people, and so on. I'm telling you that when we discuss today the contemporary crisis, this grave humanitarian issue, obviously we have to take into account what had happened, for example, going all the way back to the interwar period and the post-World War period. And when we talk about global and regional challenges, obviously we have to deal with this humanitarian issue as well as the security issue. First of all, Mother Nature, obviously, and secondly, man-made. Now, I would like to mention that academically, I think we have to keep into focus a interdisciplinary, if I may suggest, just to keep this in mind in our discussion, an interdisciplinary, holistic, I think, perspective on the discussion that we're going to have today, all the way from the historical to the linguistic, meaning the definitions, the different definitions of refugees or migrants, and so on and so forth, to the health humanitarian issue on the moral level, for example, those escaping from terrorism and war and all that. Then the geographic issue, obviously, in connection with the European Union, the Middle East and elsewhere, the sociological, the legal, the law enforcement, the economic, the political, and the administrative, and so on. Obviously, this agenda requires a full-fledged seminar, but obviously we don't have the time, but I think our speakers would be able to communicate American perspective, Russian perspective, Turkish perspective, and Latin American, and so on. Again, when we discuss this situation today, one of our academic, I think, activity I like to mention, because I looked yesterday and I found one of our participation at the hearing at the Subcommittee on Immigration and Claims of the Committee of the Judiciary, going back to 2002, dealing with the implications of transnational terrorism for the visa waiver program. And obviously this month or last month, Congress discussed the crisis of confidence preventing terrorist infiltration through the U.S. refugee and visa programs. So the question is, what is new under the sun? And obviously we know that the refugee issue and challenge is as old as humanity itself. So with that, let me invite our first speaker, Mark, to begin. Please come up here, and then we'll develop the discussion.
Thank you, Yona. Thank you, General. We're starting with the least distinguished speaker first and then working up the scale. I'm going to talk about U.S. policy and specifically with regard to Syrians. This is obviously, Syrians are the largest refugee group in the world right now, with 4 million people outside their home country and many millions more dislocated within Syria. Likewise, it's the focus of the U.S. policy debate. So it seems, at least for my purposes, that's what I wanted to focus on this afternoon. And the starting point for consideration of the issue, I think, needs to be that resettlement in the United States cannot and will not take any meaningful share of the refugee population. There have been efforts or discussion about almost a kind of bidding war as to how many refugees a different politician thinks the United States should take. They call that virtue signaling, I think, in psychology. In other words, sort of displays of how good you are by how big the number of people, Syrians, you want to take into the United States is. The United States this year has a target of 10,000 refugees being resettled. For those of you who are more familiar with the European context, the way in the United States the law works is that, or the terminology works, is that an asylee or an asylum seeker is somebody who's already in the United States, almost all of them illegal aliens. A refugee under our law is someone whom we have actually plucked out from abroad and brought here under our own power, and the distinction between those two isn't necessarily the same in different countries' refugee laws. So we are, the target, the administration's target for fiscal year 2016 is 10,000 Syrian refugees. The target overall is 85,000 refugees, but they're from Africa and South Asia and East Asia and Latin America, et cetera. Of that 85,000, 10,000 are supposed to be, or are the administration shooting for 10,000 to be from Syria. We're almost halfway through fiscal year 2016. I neglected to look up the number, but I don't think we're at 5,000 Syrian refugees yet. It's entirely possible, and I would even say likely, that 10,000 target won't be met because of the vetting and screening requirements. The administration hasn't submitted the formal request, or not request really, they just kind of tell Congress what they're going to do, and Congress says, yes, sir. But the likely request, the likely target for FY 2017 refugees is said to be 100,000 total, the increase from the current year mostly being Syrians. So let's say maybe 25,000 Syrians might be the target for next year. There have been politicians talking about much higher numbers, 100,000 Syrians admitted, that sort of thing. Doesn't seem likely, and even if it were the case, there's no way that it would address even a small fraction of the refugee issue. If we suspended all refugee resettlement other than Syrians and doubled the overall number, it still wouldn't deal with any significant, meaningful share of the population. And so resettlement is not, it has to be seen as a sort of last resort solution only in the most extreme cases, rather than a routine part of addressing the refugee crises around the world, as unfortunately it has been. And there's a number of reasons I wanted to go over why resettlement can't be the first, or even, I would submit, among the menu of options, except in the most extreme cases. First thing is, and this kind of matters in a democracy, is that communities around the country are pushing back. This is something that there is deep resistance to in the country, and in fact, there has been increasing pushback among communities across the country and states again, to the State Department's what can only be described as their high-handed approach to resettling refugees in cooperation with the Health and Human Services Department's Office of Refugee Resettlement. They basically say, you know, here you go, there's a whole bunch of people coming to your town, have a nice day. And the support from federal coffers only lasts several months, after which the local communities are left holding the bag, and this has created intense and increasingly organized resistance across the country. In fact, the State Department started calling they're calling these communities that are resisting, they call them pockets of resistance. And this was actually a term in some report. And the communities have actually taken up this term, and it's now become their rallying cry. They are pockets of resistance. I mean, there is no way that any significant level of resettlement is going to happen, if only for reasons of democratic opposition. Second point is the security aspect of it. The administration has been quite effusive in its praise of its vetting process, screening process for refugees in general, but refugees from Syria in particular, saying that it's 18 or 24 months is devoted to the screening process, what have you. In fact, there's a couple of things. First of all, it's 20 minutes of screening and 18 months of waiting around for your turn to come up. So no, there is no 18, 24 months of vetting. Secondly, vetting is simply almost a, I mean, I won't say an entirely meaningless term, but it's virtually meaningless, because how are you going to vet them? I mean, if you know, if there were if Assad had a directory of terrorists that we could then check, check against his database, well, that might be easy. It doesn't work that way. It's literally impossible, not Joe Biden literally, but literally impossible to do meaningful vetting of people coming from what is now an utterly failed, disintegrated state. And on top of that, under this issue of security and terrorism, it's not just that people who we know are terrorists are going to get in, and this has happened. There were a couple of Iraqis we admitted they turned up in Kentucky, who turns out were bomb makers. They were IED makers in Iraq, and Iraq is a place where we actually had a decent amount of data, because we had a good amount of human intelligence when we were occupying the country, and we still ended up letting them in. So the idea that we're going to successfully screen out Syrian bad guys is a fantasy. But on top of that, what about people who weren't involved in terrorism and become radicalized here? Lone wolf terrorists or what have you, people inspired by ISIS or others on the internet. This is what we saw. This isn't a refugee issue, but it's what we saw with the San Bernardino shooter and his wife. So first of all, there is literally no way to meaningfully screen out security threats when we're resettling refugees from this kind of chaotic situation. The next concern I think a lot of people have is that terrorism itself, in other words, actual people strapping a vest on themselves or bringing rifles and shooting people, is only one of the concerns. Because there's also the concern about admitting large numbers of people from what we frankly have to say are benighted and backward cultures, where what happened to the ladies of Cologne on New Year's Eve is not considered a problem. And this is why the German authorities attempted to cover that up, because it's the kind of thing that really concerns people and should concern people. And sort of as part of that issue is that our resettlement process is essentially initiated by the UNHCR. The UN High Commissioner of Refugees gives us the list of people from whom we then pick our resettled refugees. And almost without exception, Syrian refugees have been Muslim. It's something like 97% Muslim, because Christians can't, because the UNHCR picks people from its camps in Turkey and elsewhere, and Christians can't live in those camps because the Muslim refugees drive them out. So that what you have is an almost exclusively Islamic refugee flow from a country that's probably pre-war population was something like 10% Christian, and the 4 million people or so who are outside of Syria is guaranteed to be more than 10% Christian. Now, on top of that, another reason I think for concern is that, and the resistance to large-scale resettlement in the United States, is that the countries that should be participating in this initial, providing initial haven for people, are not doing so. Turkey is. Turkey has something like half the Syrians who fled Syria. It makes sense. It's a long border with Turkey. Likewise with Jordan. Likewise with Lebanon. Iraq and Egypt even have smaller but significant numbers of Syrian refugees. Saudi Arabia, though, and the other Gulf monarchies do not. They're providing a lot of money, which is nice, but these are big empty countries that have lots of money and, frankly, have lots of foreign workers whom they could send home and replace with Syrians. Now, they don't want to do it. I understand they don't want to do it, but we don't have a responsibility to pick up the slack that they simply refuse to take up. And finally, as far as my critique of large-scale resettlement, it's massively more expensive to resettle refugees in the West than it is to care for them or provide for them in their countries of first asylum in the region. We actually tried to tease out the numbers. There was a number out of Norway, which I'm not sure how reliable it was. I never even found the backup for it, but it was cited in the New York Times that resettling a Syrian in Norway is 26 times more expensive than taking care of him in the Middle East. So that kind of piqued my interest. My top researcher spent some time, actually looked into it. The proportion is much lower for here, but what we found, and we published our results at our website, cis.org, is that the 5-year cost of resettling a refugee from the Middle East in the United States is 12 times greater than the cost of providing for them in the region. And people quibble with the number. Let's say it's 10 times more, 5 times more. How much more does it have to be when it becomes an issue, not just of dollars and cents, but I would submit it's a moral issue, that it is actually morally wrong to be spending the limited resources that there are inevitably limited resources devoted to refugee care for bringing one person here. Essentially, one person wins the lottery and moves to Sioux City, Iowa, while 11 others miss out. I mean, the analogy I use is there are 12 people floundering in the water. What do? Do you throw them 12 life preservers, or do you send them a luxuriously appointed one-man yacht? Resettlement is the one-man yacht rather than 12 life preservers. So the question is, what should the United States response be to the refugee issue? The first point to keep in mind with regard to the Middle Eastern refugee issue is that the United States is blessed in many ways, but it's blessed in this sense also, is that we face many of the same problems Europe faces with regard to refugees, but ours is the decaffeinated and low-calorie version of that problem. The oceans protect us and make it impossible to get on a rubber raft for 2 hours and get here. Our own refugee issue, which one of the later speakers will speak with, or quasi-refugee issue of people, essentially it's the same kind of thing. Instead of walking through Turkey to Europe or walking through Mexico to the United States, is much more manageable for us. It's smaller. I'm talking about Central American refugees from the northern 3 countries of Central America. The numbers are dramatically smaller. The cultural differences are much narrower. And the comparison between Mexico and Turkey, which essentially play the same role in the 2 hemispheres with regard to these flows, is very different because Mexico is actually much more cooperative in limiting the refugee flow, or the ostensible refugee flow from Central America, than Turkey is in keeping the Syrians and Iraqis and others from getting to Europe. So I'm not here to come up with solutions because I don't know whether establishing safe zones in Syria is the way to go. Maybe it is. In Jordan, I think they've now started kind of, I forget what the term is, but essentially the kind of enterprise zones where refugees within their zones can work, rather, so they don't go to the town and compete with Jordanians for work, but there's essentially efforts to create opportunities for employment and earning money and kind of giving structure to people's lives. And calls for additional resources from American taxpayers, I think, are perfectly plausible and justified. But large-scale resettlement in the United States, which is the first kind of bullet item that, when this issue is discussed, cannot and will not be a viable part of the solution to the refugee problem. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to start with a personal note, which is that I am a refugee. I'm one of the people who came to the United States in the 70s. I was processed in Europe, coming from what was then the Soviet Union. I was helped with, my family was helped with resettlement, both from communities and with government assistance. All these things that are so difficult for Syrians to get were possible for the several 100,000 Soviet Jews who made it into the United States in the 70s. Now, it was also possible for 1 million Vietnamese after the Vietnam War. So, it's a lot of it is choices we have made as a country since that time about how we vet what we look for and what we do. So but I've been asked to talk about Russia, and I'm not Russian. I study Russia. I spend a lot of time looking at Russia and Russian perspectives. And Russia, unlike the United States, is not a country with a long history of resettling refugees. There have been people who've settled in Russia during wartime. A decent number of Afghans during and after the Afghan War did end up in the Soviet Union and have stayed. But nothing like the sorts of numbers the United States has resettled, nothing like the Syrian crisis. Right now, there are about 200,000 refugees in Russia, and the numbers of how many of them are from Syria vary. About 2,000 Syrians have actually gotten asylum in Russia since the start of this. I don't know how this compares to the U.S. numbers, actually. That'd be something worth looking up. I spent some time looking at U.S. efforts to resettle Afghans and Iraqis who had worked with the U.S. in those countries, and that was hard enough, right? So I imagine our numbers are low, but like Mark, I haven't actually looked at them recently. I think the question with Russia, and a lot of the refugees that Russia will say are in Russia are coming from Ukraine. I've had one Russian tell me there are about 5,000 people a day entering Russia from Ukraine. I have no idea if that's true or not. Kind of the other question when it comes to Russia is the extent to which Russia is part of the problem, right? We've had a U.S. military NATO leader say that Russia is weaponizing the refugee crisis. And, you know, honestly, if Russia is weaponizing the refugee crisis, if Russia is doing all these horrible things, striking civilian targets, all of this precisely with a goal of attacking civilians and forcing the war to continue, that's a war crime. It should be prosecuted as such once you've got all the evidence. I'm not sure that's really what's going on. I do think Russia benefits in some ways from the refugee crisis. I think it can point to it on the one hand as a failure of other states to adapt to resettle refugees, to settle the conflict. It also is a helpful reminder to the Europeans that there are dangers, threats, and worries much greater than that of Russia, so maybe pay a little less attention to Ukraine and a little more attention to your south. But I think kind of the broader question is, you know, whether this is what Russia's doing intentionally. I'm not sure. I think what Russia's doing is trying to prop up the Assad government, and its argument for propping up the Assad government has consistently been one of stability. It benefits from the continuing conflict, but it also benefits from the seat at the table that it's got on Syria, and it's bombed its way from just a regular seat at the table to a seat at the head of the table and a place as part of the resolution of the problem, which I think it's very happy about. So the extent to which it can stay there and feed into that narrative of being a global great power that's important on every issue, I think they're pretty happy with it. They're also, you know, the Russians will tell you they've been supplying humanitarian assistance all along. Certainly the ceasefire that was negotiated at the end of February and seems to be holding has facilitated more humanitarian assistance, and the Russians keep offering help. You hear different reports on how good that is. I've actually had a really hard time figuring out exactly what goes through where. And it's also important to recognize that the story we get here in the West about civilian casualties caused by Russian airstrikes, weaponization of refugees, etc., is very different from the narratives that Russians get and Russians read and hear, which is about Russia being in Syria to stabilize a situation, a conflict caused by U.S. support for people who sought to overthrow a regime that maybe wasn't the nicest regime, but hey, it was holding things together. And this is the mess, and Russia is now working with the U.S. to help solve that mess. So I'm going to close with a little bit about kind of Russia in general, Russian humanitarian history. As I said, it's not a big destination country for refugees. It's not a huge humanitarian assistance provider globally. It's not that wealthy a country. So, you know, if you're looking for countries that are going to finance the resettlement of refugees elsewhere in the Middle East, and most refugees are in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, right? The number of people coming to Europe is very small compared to that. I wouldn't count on the Russians. The Russians are continuing a fight with the Norwegians because there are some folks who are trying to transit Russia to get to Norway, and Norwegians are sending them back. Norwegians are complaining they're not even Syrian. Some of them are Afghans. They may have lived in Russia all this time. Now they're using this as an opportunity. You know, it seems like a... From here in the United States, it seems like a very strange debate, and neither country looks good in it, right? But, you know, the bottom line here is Russia's interest in Syria is only very tangentially related to the refugee crisis. The refugee crisis has some benefits for Russia in the sense that they can use it symbolically, but they're not, other than in the sense of resolving the conflict, they're not going to be a huge player in resettling refugees or responding to them. On the other hand, you can settle that conflict, an awful lot of people will be able to go home, and, you know, in my other life with another hat on, I've done some interviews with refugees in Syria, in Lebanon and in Jordan, and I can tell you they want to go home. They don't really want, you know, resettlement is a second choice for most of these people. What they'd really like is peace in their country and to go home. Russia's not going to play a huge role here, but some of the rest of us can. So, thanks.
Thank you, Professor Alexander. Actually, this has been a fait accompli for me to be a panelist, but I'm glad that you gave this chance for us to express Turkey's views. And particularly after listening to Mr. Krikorian's speech, I would like to express a few points. First of all, I mean, for my country, for the country that I represent, the refugee crisis and the overall security implications of the political crisis in Syria is not just a theoretical exercise. I mean, this is very real. Just along our 911 kilometers, which is more than almost 600 miles, long border with Syria. I mean, we're having the repercussions and the impacts of the crisis in Syria on a daily basis. And in Turkey today, there is more than 2,750,000 Syrian refugees. And only 272,000 of those are residing currently in camps. The number of camps in Turkey are 26. Actually, we call them temporary protection centers, not camps, because they are not like the camps that you are generally used to see in these kind of refugee situations. The standards are really high there. But our main problem is, of course, those refugees. They are not in the camps, but living in non-camp situations, so-called urban refugees. And you can imagine the huge burden 2,750,000 people add on Turkey's security, social, economic apparatus and humanitarian aid system as well. So I listened to Mr. Krikorian with bewilderment when he said that the resettlement of 10,000 Syrian refugees, which is, I believe, the target of the U.S. administration, would cost 10 times more to U.S. administration than the burden on neighboring countries that host refugees. I find that very interesting, and I really would be happy to hear his researchers' cost analysis on that respect, because Turkey so far during the last 4.5 years has spent $10 billion only for those refugees that are residing in camps. I'm not adding the medical expenses, because free health care is extended to the Syrian refugees, be it in the camps or not, and other also education opportunities are provided them. So I'm not counting the expenses in that regard, just the camp refugees, and $10 billion Turkey spent so far. And as a matter of fact, the majority of the assistance Turkey extended to the refugees on its territory has been mainly from Turkey's own resources. The international and bilateral multilateral and bilateral assistance that we have received has been very limited, and I can actually provide you some numbers in that regard. Turkey is a part of the UN Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan, which is 3RP, and in 2015, the total amount requested for Turkey was $624 million US, and only 46% of that was funded. And the amount of contributions we received bilaterally and multilaterally from the international community so far have been limited to $455 million US. So I think you can compare the $10 billion with the $455 million. But I mean, money is not the issue. I mean, Turkey, since the beginning of the crisis, has approached this problem from a purely humanitarian and humane manner. And this is why we kept our doors open to the refugees who seek protection in Turkey, who flee the war in Syria, who flee the terror in Syria, and who just, wants to feel the safety and protection that has been provided in Turkey. So we kept our doors open all the time, and we also strictly abided by the non-refoulement principle towards the Syrian refugees, and reworked our emergency response capacity, took it to the next level, often exceeding international standards, and we did all these things mainly by ourselves. Of course, some of our colleagues and the international community, United Nations, UNHCR, World Food Programme has helped, but as I said, it was mainly Turkey's, from own resources. Speaking of the population aspect of the problem, in some southeastern towns of Turkey, such as Kilis, for example, the number of the refugee population exceeds the local population. The number of refugees in Kilis is 137,000, whereas the whole population of Kilis is 120,000. But, it has not been an issue for Turkey, neither for the people living in Kilis, nor for the overall general Turkish public opinion, a problem that we are having those number of refugees. And when Mr. Krikorian mentioned that, it's very hard to make vetting, and also the 18 months screening process is actually just 20 minutes, and it's literally impossible to do meaningful vetting. I think Turkey doesn't have that luxury, and we didn't have that luxury at all. When people came to our borders fleeing from the bombardments of the Syrian regime or the terrorist attacks of Daesh, we couldn't, tell them, or we couldn't have the luxury to tell them, just stay there. We're not allowed to let you in, because first of all, we have to screen you thoroughly to learn, to understand whether you're a terrorist, whether you're someone with, ill intentions or not. We didn't have that luxury, but still we did that. Not just because, of the humane manner that our main policy approach was based on, but because it was our international responsibility. And it's not just the Turkey's or the neighboring countries' responsibility to do so, that's the global community's responsibility to do so. And another point I'd like to also emphasize is that, Professor Alexander, when you show the that poor toddler's photo, that was actually a breakthrough in how the international community approached the issue of Syrian refugees. After 4.5 years, finally, that was the moment when, the global public opinion recognized the existence of this problem and the magnitude of this problem. Unfortunately, we human beings suffer from short-term memory loss, I'm afraid to say so, because still we are, putting security issues and concerns and our fears, before humane and protection-related issues. And yes, the majority of the Syrian refugees are Muslims. There are also Christians, and as a matter of fact, in Turkey, for the Christian Syrians, originated Syrians, we have established special camps because they didn't want to stay in the same camps with other, refugees, with Sunni Muslims. So we set up special camps in Mardin, which had a 5,000 capacity, and also in Kilis again. So we also took into account the special needs of certain groups, religious groups coming from Syria. But when you say that we will not allow Muslims and we will only get Christians, as a matter of fact, you aggravate the security problem, security concern, because that you very much fear of, because that's the very basic pretext of the extremist organizations, Daesh and other radical extremists. They are saying that they don't care about you. The West doesn't care about you. See, they're not letting you in on the basis of purely that you're a Muslim or you're from Syria. I think this is more dangerous than, letting people in, because you, in a way, help flourishment of the extremist ideology. So I would like to just briefly finalize my comments. I mean, how we approach the problem. Well, I mean, from our point of view, refugee crisis is not a standalone problem. It's like the other implications of the crisis in Syria, actually part of the bigger problem, which is the political crisis in Syria. So, without addressing that root cause, all other measures that we will try to apply to mitigate the effects of the humanitarian crisis or the refugee crisis will be null. I mean, it will not give a result. However, I mean, there is the absence of the political solution. But the humanitarian and refugee crisis is still going on, and as a matter of fact, it's getting worse and worse each and every day. Then there is another kind of approach needed, required, and this is what we propose and advocate, is a multi-layered approach to the refugee crisis. So first of all, we believe that we should aim at preventing an IDP inside Syria to become a refugee, in order to, limit the burden on the countries of the neighboring countries. So we should first of all aim at providing protection and humanitarian assistance to the Syrians inside Syria. And for that, we have to have some type of a civilian or humanitarian zone. I mean, be it under the name of no-fly zone, no bombardment zone, whatever, but there should be a civilian humanitarian zone. And unfortunately, we have not been able to cross this message to have impact at the UN Security Council, but hope that this message will be heard by certain circles. And secondly, the second layer is we should prevent refugees fall into despair or into the hands of terrorist extremist crime networks. And how we can do that? By providing sustainable humanitarian aid to those refugees in their communities where they found refuge. We should improve their living standards. And the Syrian humanitarian crisis has become a protracted humanitarian crisis. So with no longer the traditional means of humanitarian assistance, we can sort out this problem. There should be also the development aspect of this problem. I mean, it has been 5 years, and unfortunately, the prospects are dim, so the crisis will linger for quite some time. So there should be also the element of the developmental assistance to the host countries where refugees are living. And also we should create livelihoods for those refugees. And as a matter of fact, Turkey has taken that initiative. As of January 2016, a new bylaw came into effect that allows the access of Syrians to the labor market in Turkey. So that would create, I believe, a new incentive for those Syrian refugees to earn their livings in Turkey and to, have a proper way of life there. The third layer is to prevent illegal trafficking by creating new legal venues for migration and asylum. As a matter of fact, this issue falls upon the category of the deal that we have reached with the European Union. By creating, legal venues for migration, European Union would also help preventing the illegal trafficking of refugees. And resettlement opportunity, we believe, must also be extended to the refugees, and those programs should become more functional and efficient. And to this end, we expect all members of the international community to act responsibly, not just the countries of the region. And the fourth layer is absolutely the international cooperation. I mean, we have to strengthen the international cooperation on security plus refugee-related issues, and this is what we, I mean, this is what is missing, actually. There is not enough cooperation on that issue, and we actually expect the international community to act more in line with the principles of burden sharing and solidarity. And finally, on the security side of the problem, actually, I couldn't find time to talk about the terrorism threat that is, targeting Turkey from Syria. Actually, this is the major concern that we have. But as I said, I mean, we separate the terrorism issue from the refugee issue because both are actually the byproducts and symptoms of a bigger problem. So this is why they have to be dealt separately in our view. But on terrorism, we believe that we have to speak the same language, that there is no such concept like there's good terrorists and bad terrorists. I mean, for us, be it PYD, YPG, PKK, Al-Nusra, or Daesh, they're all terrorists, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend discourse is very dangerous for the region. And last but not least, I would like to say that we also expect the allied solidarity to be strengthened more on issues that are affecting Turkey and the region, because there are several other factors that increase the threat perceptions of Turkey and the countries of the region, and we have to work more on those issues and for the solution of the political crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Professor Alexander, to inviting me to give this presentation. The situation in Central America is obviously not the same as what we heard in Syria or in Iraq, but it has a very big impact in the United States. And as you should know, from the middle of the 1960s to the end of 2014, more than 16 million Mexican nationals migrated to the United States in one of the largest mass migrations in modern history. But over the last 10 years, Mexican migration to the USA just slowed. Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, known as the Northern Triangle countries in Central America have emerged as one of the most dangerous areas on the planet outside of active war zones. The growing presence of sophisticated criminal organizations, the endemic corruption and impunity at all levels of law enforcement and government, not to mention the violation of human rights, have created unprecedented security challenges from very aggressive and dangerous gangs and organized crime cartels. Those guys are really, really nasty, dangerous and nasty. These challenges are not new, but they are growing in intensity and visibility. As the risk of human security increases, so does the vulnerability of migrants who cross the region moving northward toward the United States. The dangers have become particularly vivid in Mexico, where known numbers of Mexicans, Central American and South American migrants have been killed, gone missing, presumably at hands of criminal actors or corrupt public officials. Many more are victims of extortion, kidnapping, rape, and other crimes. The resurgence is a product of a grave levels of violence in the region. The Northern Triangle countries registered some of the worst homicide rates in the world by the end, by the end of 2015. El Salvador had the highest rate with 104 homicides per 100,000 people. That's almost twice as many as Honduras, which registered 57 per 100,000 people, and Guatemala, 36 homicides per 100,000 people. Today, Mexico, with the help of the United States, serves as a land bridge for Central American immigrants traveling to the United States. And we are showing also Venezuela, which is becoming a very, very dangerous country, basically Caracas. Caracas is almost the same as El Salvador. After finding 72 bodies at one ranch in northeast Mexico belonging to migrants who were making their way toward the United States in 2014, the Mexican government committed to increase the enforcement at its southern border. All of the immigrants were from Central America and Ecuador. The motive for the killings was that Mexico drug cartels have expanded their activities to include extortion and kidnapping of immigrants, as well as recruiting them to force them to become part of their group of hitmen or sicarios. In 2015, the Mexican government carried out about 150,000 deportations of unauthorized immigrants from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, a 44% jump over the previous year. These three Central American countries alone accounted for nearly 97% of Mexico deportations in 2015. 46,000 more were deported from the United States, according to the Office of United Nations High Commissioner Refugee. Statistics of the same office show that the request of asylum for the United States by displaced people from Northern Triangle region rose from 8,000 in 2010 to 200,000 in 2014. From October 2015 through January 2016, U.S. Border Patrols apprehended 20,500 kids without companion from 9 crossings in the United States Southwest, a 102% increase over the same period of a year earlier. Another 24,600 Central American migrants were apprehended in the same time period, a 170% increase over the last year. More Cubans are also traveling through Mexico to reach the United States. The number of Cubans migrating through Mexico to reach the United States spiked dramatically last year after President Barack Obama said that the United States would renew ties with the island nation. In the fiscal year 2015, 43,200 Cubans entered the United States via port of entry, a 78% increase over the previous year. 2/3 of these Cubans arrived through the United States Border Patrol in Laredo, Texas. And just to remind you, Cubans who pass inspection can enter the USA legally under the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966. Those are the kids that they travel in this train called the Bestia, the Beast. It's a very impressive train. Starts in the southern border in Mexico. The people come from Honduras, from El Salvador, from Guatemala. They just wait in the Mexican side for the train to leave, and they start to jump into the train. And remember, the distance between Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras, to Laredo, Texas, the border, is 1,600 miles by land. No problem, no sea, no oceans, just it's here in the backyard. On February 24 of this year, before Vice President Joe Biden got on a plane to Mexico, he met in Washington with the presidents of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to discuss the plans for the Alliance for Prosperity, an initiative between the four countries aimed to boosting security and economic support in an effort to stem a refugee crisis. The U.S. Congress approved $700 million in 2016 budget for development assistance for Central America, down from $1 billion. The same $750 million figure is included in the 2017 budget proposal the executive submitted on February 9. The $750 million appropriated for the Alliance for 2016, which launched in November 2014, after the migrant crisis peaked that summer is a significant increase from previous USA assistance to the region. From 2008 to 2015, Washington disbursed $1.15 billion through the Central America Regional Security Initiative, CARSI. This is the strategy, and as you can see, they approach the strategy on combating crime, homicides, gangs, corruption, police, legal aspects, etc., and prevention. But they don't take in consideration development, which in my opinion is the biggest problem in this area. No education, no development, no a policy of reducing poverty. So the people in these countries, they see the United States as a magnet to cross. And if we take in consideration that the gangs are trying to recruit the kids for their crime purposes, you know, they just leave the country. The Northern Triangle countries will have to prove that they are working to reduce migration and human trafficking, combat government corruption, and increase poverty. Just some of the items among a considerable list. The United States Department and Agency for International Development, which are jointly in charge of administrating the money, will have to report to the Congress by September 30th of this year on whether sufficient progress has been made, and if not, funding could be suspended. These countries are also required to cooperate with the United States to stem the flow of migrants. Honduras has made its own commitment of $965 million for the alliance. The Obama administration decision to launch a deportation rates at the start of 2016, in New Year's weekend, 121 Central American migrants were flown out of the country. And this triggered a counter-reaction. Given another boost of migration for the Northern Triangle countries, the White House responded by the end of January, announcing the expansion of the U.S. refugee admissions program to accept more Central American migrants. The president did not specify how many more would be allowed to stay in addition to the 3,000 slot already planned by 2016. Well, I try to give you a snapshot, picture of what's going on in Central America, why people decide to come to the United States. But it will take us maybe 2 or 3 hours to analyze all the factors of what's going on, not only in Central America, but we have to take in consideration South America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. We have to take in consideration what's going on in Cuba, and in my point of view, Venezuela is really a red flag. So maybe, Professor, this could be a very good starting point on analyzing the Latin America problems and issues in this excellent forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Obviously, the panelists triggered a lot of issues and questions. So let me begin by asking a question, one in terms of the historical lessons that we had in the post-World War II, all the way, you mentioned, Mark, for example, the resettlement, but also one of the major approaches was repatriation and also restitution issues related to Europe, obviously. And my question to all the panelists, basically, they want to respond, is not only the national responses in terms of the legal definition, for example, and the efforts to deal with the refugees, but since we spoke about international cooperation, is the UN High Commission for the Refugees, for example. And also, obviously, we have to take into account not only the threats of the refugees or the asylum seekers moving to other countries, but the displaced internal persons that challenge the situation within particular countries themselves. And the other issue, the security issue, is not only the terrorism issue, but let's say the organized crime, the smugglers, for example, human smugglers. And I think the Turkish court just recently, they sentenced some of the people who were involved in the smuggling of some of these refugees to about, I think, 4 years in jail and so on. So we have also the legal system involved. And finally, the economic issue that Abe mentioned, which is so critical to deal with this issue. And my question is whether, in terms of international cooperation, we can revive the NAFTA setup, not only the United States and Mexico, but also Canada, which is another challenge. So again, if you want to respond to some of these issues, and then we'll open up discussion.
Sure. Several things, several points I'd like to make. I guess the first, your last point about, I assume, sort of relating broadly to the issue of economic development, is that kind of the solution? And the answer is, in the long run, yes, but in the long run, we're all dead, as Keynes said, and states have to deal with their interests now, not decades or generations in the future, hoping that development will take place. And honestly, I mean, development aid is not my area, but I'm not persuaded that we really know how to, that we can write checks and throw money at a problem and that results in economic development. I mean, this is a whole area of expertise and study, but the fact is it's not simply a question of writing a check and that solves the problem. I mean, development is a complex phenomenon. Institutions have to develop and all this, and this is, so yes, if there were a way to wave a wand and turn Honduras into Norway, that would be great. There isn't. And I don't think anybody has an answer about how to do that in any meaningful time frame. So, but NAFTA specifically is an important point, because this isn't really a refugee thing, but it's a broader point about migration. The point of NAFTA, in a sense, when you get right down to it, simplifying it, was to push the excess farmers off the land in Mexico so that agriculture would develop and the excess farmers would move to the city and get urban jobs instead of rural jobs. That's the way development's always worked in Europe, here, everywhere. That's just what development means, is excess farmers move to the city and get urban jobs. The problem that using NAFTA as a kind of model is that NAFTA needed to have been accompanied by very strict border controls, because what happened was the excess farmers left the land and they moved to our cities instead of Mexico's cities, or at least a very, very large share of them did. And so any kind of approach that looks at economic development as the long-term solution has to understand that economic development always sets in motion, even apart from the refugee issue, sets in motion migration flows that you have to deal with. And the only other point I bring up, I'm sure everybody else, I mean, I'm sure I've provoked everybody, so I'm happy to hear responses, but specifically with regard to Turkey as well as Jordan and others. The basic point is that geography is a harsh mistress. Iran and Pakistan ended up hosting millions of Afghan refugees because they were next door. Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon are going to end up hosting, and Iraq to a lesser degree, almost all of the Syrian refugees because they're next door. That's the way it is. And life isn't fair, geography isn't fair, it's just fact. And the role that people elsewhere, countries elsewhere have, is in fact to help those neighboring countries deal with this, the result of geography. And I'm all for that, but inevitably, if you're next door to a place that's falling apart, you know, or if your house is next door to a house that's burning, you know, that's your problem that you have to deal with. Others can come and help you, and should help you, and it's in our interest, as far as the United States specifically I'm talking about, to help Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon and others to deal with, and maybe do more, almost certainly do more than we're doing now to help them deal with their flows. I mean, to, you know, the burden of people who've moved there. But the way, but ultimately they're the ones who are left holding the bag, because that's the way geography works.
Right. Olga, I want to ask you, I would say, to respond to any of those, but particularly, if I may raise, again, this question of forced internal displaced people, also refugees, let's say in Chechnya or the Caucasus, Georgia, for example, the Ukraine and all that. And when we talk about Russia, obviously, you know, it is within their borders of former Soviet republics and so on.
Okay, a few thoughts, points. First on Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey. You know, UNHCR is, as you say, there are a ton of UN agencies in there. UNICEF, UNHCR, UNDP, everybody is in there. They're all chronically underfunded, doing their best. They're all also chronically expensive. There is a tendency for the international community to respond to refugee crises by doing things themselves, not working through local governments. That's because historically there's a model of what a refugee crisis looks like, which is that people from a poverty-stricken, non-functional country go into another poverty-stricken, non-functional country. That's not actually what's here. Right? Here we've got middle-income country war with people fleeing to other middle-income countries. So you actually have state capacity that could do more. There are challenges with funneling funds to them. Lebanon, for example, has Hezbollah in its government, which keeps the United States from giving it direct assistance. But, you know, they're on the one hand chronically underfunded. On the other hand, there are probably some cost savings to be had from some efficiencies. Russia and the frozen conflicts on its borders and the refugee crises that have resulted. I mean, yes, that's that is a side of refugee crises are side effects of frozen conflicts, both, and some of it's internal displacement. A lot of it is semi-internal displacement, right? If you've been displaced from a place that has declared independence from your country, are you internally displaced? Are you a refugee? I mean, by UN terminology, you're probably internally displaced. You may feel an awful lot like a refugee. Again, is Russia doing this sort of thing on purpose? No, but it's doing it with some, you know, when Russia gets involved in these things, it's doing it with some awareness that these are things that will happen. Some level of ethnic cleansing, and with it some level of displacement. On the other hand, if you look at the situation in East Ukraine, you've got Ukrainians from that region displaced both into the rest of Ukraine and into Russia. So, you know, with repercussions for both. How that plays out in the long term, I don't know. It's so, you know, while you might be aware that your war is likely to cause displacement, most wars will cause displacement, it can be hard to predict the results. I don't know how satisfactory an answer that is, but.
Marco? Yeah, can I ask you to comment on Turkey as a member of NATO, which also brings up the security issue, and as we know that obviously the refugee, I think, crisis is related obviously to the terrorist attacks within Turkey, but also, I mean, in Syria, and then the terrorist attacks within Turkey itself, the PKK, for example, and to discuss the cooperation between Turkey and NATO members on the one hand, and secondly, the ongoing discussions with the European community in regards specifically to how to assist Turkey to deal with this grave humanitarian issue?
Well, actually, the answer to this question is a comprehensive one, and it's very difficult to briefly explain it. But let me start from the security dimension. I mean, the Turkish-Syrian border is one of the most dangerous borders in the world today. So, I mean, because of this, and because of the security situation inside Syria, and the ongoing civil war there, and the many existence of terrorist organizations, radical groupings, Turkey is directly affected from what's going on in Syria. But I mean, as I said in my presentation, in my intervention, before, that we deal with the refugee crisis separately than the security dimensions of the Syrian political crisis. Yes, there has been terrorist attacks in Turkey perpetrated by both Daesh and PKK and its affiliate in Syria, and we have suffered a lot due to those attacks. And unlike the terrorist bombings in European Union or elsewhere, it didn't make the headlines that much. But since 2013, the time when Turkey designated Daesh as a terrorist organization, actually earlier than many of the other countries in the world, there has been more than 8 terror attacks that targeted Turkish civilians. So terrorism from Syria is a big concern for us, but those attacks were not perpetrated, not committed by refugees themselves. So I mean, this is why we should separate both issues. But that doesn't mean that while opening our borders to the Syrian refugees, that we are not taking into account our security requirements as well. Of course we do. Border security is a very important issue for us. And during the last couple of years, since the Syrian crisis started, we have actually built an enormous capacity on that issue. There are many figures that I can share with those interested after the meeting. I don't want to go into too much detail, but we had a lot of progress in terms of border security. But of course, since this is a very dangerous border, and it's unlike the Mexican-U.S. border, it's not. There is a civil war on the other side of the border, and as I said, a terrorist organization is not easy task for Turkey. And so the same applies to the western borders of Turkey as well. The illegal human trafficking, another issue of concern for us, and we have been fighting this problem actually earlier before the refugee crisis, occurred. Since 2002, I mean, there were some, Turkey was targeting the illegal trafficking networks, crime networks, and we have been taking measures to prevent those incidents. However, we should also accept that, unlike normal times, we are facing an extreme burden. I mean, we're talking about maybe in normal times before the crisis, there will be maybe 5 or 10 incidents, but right now we're talking about more than 50 or sometimes hundreds. But as you have mentioned, our security forces are working hard to prevent those things to happen. But of course, it's not just Turkey's responsibility to do that. It's not Turkey's honest or work hard duty. It's also the duty of the international community, to prevent such kind of incidents. And everything, brings us to the same question, that the whole situation in Syria. I mean, if we do, by overlooking what's going on there, we can neither solve or nor mitigate the problems that we face arising from there. So when I mentioned the allied solidarity and international cooperation, I meant the sharing of responsibility and the burden, and taking into account the huge burden emanating from the refugee crisis, as well as the security concerns of Turkey. And this is what we expect from our friends.
Okay, thank you.
Can I
Yeah,
clarify
go
just
ahead,
one
Mike.
thing, and this is an important distinction I think to make, is that trafficking and smuggling are two different things. I mean, when we talk about trafficking, what that means is there's a certain element of coercion. You know, you're trafficking in young girls for the sex trade, something like this. In other words, it's not people, I mean, obviously there's a certain amount of overlap in a gray area. You entered voluntarily and then they kidnapped you or whatever, but trafficking is a very different thing from smuggling. Smuggling is a voluntary act. And what we're seeing in the Aegean is smuggling, not trafficking, really. Some of it probably is, but for the most part, that poor kid who died on the beach in Turkey, his father was not, nobody was being trafficked. His father made a conscious decision, not as a refugee, but to become a regular illegal alien in Europe. In other words, he was already had fled the war and chose to attempt to take his family to some place where he could get a better job.
Or a job.
Well, he was working in Turkey, actually. The fact is that that's an actual act, smuggling, not trafficking, and legally they're different. They kind of have to be dealt with differently because one is part of ordinary illegal immigration, the other has an element of coercion and kidnapping. Anyway, I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay. Abe, do you want to make a comment on the NAFTA or some other issue? No, okay. So we'll open it up to discussion. Here we have some, I think, people who worked on these issues for decades. Dr. Pat Murphy, please. Can you get him the mic?
We hear about refugees, we hear about people looking for new jobs and so on. I believe that in the history of the United States, the majority of people that came here did not come here because they were political refugees, but because they were looking for a better economic life. And I have never quite understood the distinction between economic refugees who are, looking for a better job, and understandable, and political refugees. They can be equally oppressed in their home country, either because they got no money or because they said the wrong thing. I'm interested in comments from any of you about that. Why does that distinction exist? And where is it written down? In national law, in the UN, elements regarding the charter, or where? Where does it come from? And why do we make that distinction?
The Refugee Convention specifically lays out, defines a refugee as someone who is persecuted or fears persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or, and this is the catch-all term, membership in a particular social group, which originally meant like aristocrats and kulaks and people that weren't really political. They didn't belong to a separate religious group, but people wanted to kill them anyway. And it's become kind of a loophole for activist judges to make up all kinds of new categories for asylum. But the point is, it's in the law. It's in the U.S. Refugee Act, which is based on the Refugee Convention. And I mean, I think there's something, I don't know, what's the kind of theoretical basis below it is that, there's poverty everywhere, and if poverty were a reason you would get a special right to move to another country, because that's what refugee or asylum is a person who either is an illegal immigrant and is given a special right to stay, or is plucked out from somewhere and brought here. That should be the bar for that should be pretty high and unique, as opposed to simply living in a place that's poor and living in poor circumstances, which would cover billions of people in the world.
Okay. Next, yes, sir.
Hello, just a quick question. Mr. Krikorian, you said when mentioning the resettlement as a last resort rather than a routine practice, you said admitting people from backward cultures will be problematic. Can you elaborate on that? Like, what do you mean by the backward cultures?
I mean, Cologne, Germany on New Year's Eve is what I mean. In other words,
Because Germans never sexually harass people, right? It's
very
only
different.
Muslims.
This
Sorry,
is
but
a
I
very
mean,
different. This is a radically different phenomenon, and the fact is that we're talking about admitting people whose upbringing and whose cultural milieu is fundamentally, I won't say contradictory, but deeply inconsistent with the values of a modern liberal society. It's not just, didn't just happen in Cologne. Europe is seeing it everywhere. It's actually a much, again, along the same lines of what I'd said, we have a decaffeinated version of that problem. Because clearly Honduran peasants coming to an urban, modern society in the United States are undergoing a kind of culture shock, but the cultural distance is significantly less. It just is. It's the way it is. And this isn't an argument. I wasn't actually arguing for admitting only Christian refugees. My point was that it's the other way around. We are admitting from Syria almost exclusively Muslim refugees. So, but my point here is that there is, in fact, all cultures aren't equally compatible. And that doesn't mean that, no Muslim is allowed to move to the United States, sort of Trump style. That's kind of stupid. But it is real, and I think there is an important role, I would say, in refugee resettlement as well as regular immigration resettlement, for screening people for acceptance of liberal values. I think people should be asked, do you think the law should punish blasphemy? And if the answer is yes, you don't get to move here, period. I mean, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Ralf Lesser. I'm the German liaison officer to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. First of all, I would like to thank all panelists for their great speeches and the good debate. As Cologne in Germany was mentioned a couple of times, I just want to state that the police criminal statistics in Germany show that the refugees and asylum seekers coming to Germany are not more or less criminal than German citizens. And that is what my question to you, Mark Krikorian, is referring to. Where do you get your numbers from? And quite similar to what you said before, you mentioned that the lone wolf problematic, that those phenomena might be a reason not to let refugees into the country because that danger and threat might increase. To quote your own president, the lone wolf phenomenon is a phenomenon that occurs in the U.S. more than in any other country. So what makes you assume, do you have any statistics, any studies, that there may be more lone wolf attacks in the U.S. because of refugees? You mentioned San Bernardino for that phenomenon. You mentioned Cologne as a horrible example for criminal acts, but I would be very interested if there are any more numbers and general statistics behind what you've said.
I'm
Thanks.
actually not talking about criminality necessarily. Criminality is the way it sometimes manifests itself, these cultural incompatibilities. But it's not just criminality. It's creating an environment where, in parts of Sweden or Britain, women can't walk on the street without their heads covered. There's no criminality involved. There's a social pressure brought by illiberal values becoming dominant in certain areas because of large-scale importation of people who are not criminals necessarily. I mean, some are. People are just people. Some are good, some are bad. But who bring with them cultural expectations that are inherently inconsistent with the values of a liberal society. Screening people by asking them, for instance, do you think homosexuals should be killed? If the answer is yes, then that person should not be admitted to a modern, democratic, liberal society, whatever his circumstances are, period. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. There will be a lot of people from these societies that, frankly, will be misfits in their own societies but would fit in ours. people who are either secular or even if they're religious are happy to live and let live, that kind of thing. That doesn't create the kind of cultural incompatibilities I'm talking about. But the things that I'm talking about are simply much more common among people coming from, for instance, from Syria or Iraq than they are, and again, I get back to my low-calorie, decaffeinated version of the problem, than they are, frankly, for people from Guatemala or Honduras. And so my point here is that we have an easier burden to bear, an easier challenge to deal with than Europe does, because the people Europe is from, whether from North Africa, from West Africa, from the Middle East, or from Afghanistan, are overwhelmingly Muslim, and because of that, quite frankly, are much more likely to hold illiberal views that cause real social problems in the destination societies, sometimes manifesting itself as crime, but not that often.
Okay. We have a question over there first.
My question is, what are your thoughts, what are your expectations after the Balkan route is closed to Europe? What developments do you expect in regards of the refugee crisis, and especially those groups that are blocked in Greece, in Turkey mainly, and in Serbia? There are some in Serbia and Macedonia. And my second question is, what does Turkey have any plan to integrate those people into the society? 3 million, more than 3 million people. Or what are your expectations for them to return back to Syria, or to find alternative roads to reach Western Europe? Thank you.
If you have asked this question to me 4 years ago, when the crisis first started, I would absolutely say that, of course, we are looking into, those refugees turn back to their own countries, and then and for this, the necessary conditions should be created inside Syria. That would be my talking point. But I mean, after 4.5 years, we have also come to the, conclusion, and our awareness has increased that these refugees are here to stay. At least majority of them. Though there are some surveys that are conducted, tells that 60 to 70% of the refugees after the crisis in Syria is over wants to return back to their homeland. We don't know how long this would take for the political solution to realize, and the real stability and the economic conditions, infrastructure, everything to be developed in Syria. So we acknowledge that refugees are here to stay with us, at least for a longer term, or maybe more than that. And this is why we adopted our humanitarian policy and refugee policy on the basis of these realities. This is why, as I have mentioned before, last January, we have adopted a new bylaw that allows Syrians to access to the labor market, so that they can, earn their livings, and that they can, integrate better to the society. And this is why we are also enrolling Syrian children to Turkish schools to educate them in order not to, create lost generations. So after these kids, getting education in Turkish schools, most probably, they would stay in Turkey. And since the employment opportunity is also being provided to the people, to the Syrians, then that would be an option for them to stay in Turkey. And since we do not, regard Syrians as a background culture, we might regard people, certain people, as background or radicals or extremists, but not the whole population. We are not afraid of, integration-related issues. Whereas, on the other hand, this problem continues to grow, and, as I said, exceeds our own capacities and capabilities. For example, I would like to give an example on education issue. Currently, there are 700,000 school-age Syrians in Turkey, but only 400,000 of them can have education due to the infrastructure problems, due to the language barrier, because first they have to learn Turkish and then continue their studies. But we have, for example, aimed at giving education to the rest, to the all, school-age children. This is a goal that we set for ourselves on education issue. We are aware of the challenges, but this issue will continue to grow. This is why we are saying that let's not, leave the whole burden to the countries of the region and the Turkey, but also, share the responsibility, share the burden. Either help the Syrian refugees inside Turkey. Actually, that was the reason of the deal we have reached with the European Union. Help us so that we can help them. That was our goal when reaching to that deal. So either we would, increase the humanitarian assistance plus the development assistance to the host countries so that they can better provide opportunities to the refugees, or you would resolve, political crisis, quagmire in Syria. But just briefly, Turkey, as I said, will continue its open door policy, and we have also agreed to, readmit those refugees who crossed the Aegean to Europe. But we also expect from the international community to take some burden on our shoulders and help us in that regard through resettlement, through international assistance, and through development assistance. Thank you.
Okay, right there.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Your name says Krikorian. I assume you have an Armenian background. May I say Barev? Thank you. As far as I know, in America, people who live in this country overwhelmingly are religious. Overwhelmingly. They are either Christians, Jewish, or Muslims. Among all these three traditions, liberalism may not mean all that much because they have a set of books and rules and regulations and adhere to that. But that doesn't mean that they are not tolerant. So if somebody's coming from the other side and we want to ask him, which in American terms is a litmus test, when somebody wants to appoint somebody, say we will have a litmus test which is not allowed. So how could we ask somebody coming in that do you do this, do you do that, and base our allowing this person to join our society on the answer that is going to give, because in their culture is forbidden to do certain things.
We already do this. It's just that I'm suggesting we add some questions. In other words, if you were a member of the Nazi Party, which, at this point it's kind of irrelevant, but that's on the books. There's all kinds of exclusions like that. I don't really care what your religious tradition is. If you think it's okay to throw homosexuals from the top of a building, you don't get to move here. I'm not saying, and our question should not be, do you want your son to marry a man? That's not the question. The question is public life. Do you approve of the state using the law to punish those who insult Mohammed or Jesus or Moses? Yes or no? And if the answer is yes, find another country. That's what it boils down to. And my point here is not even that there should be a long checklist and you need to get a score of 88 in order to be allowed in this respect. My point is there should be a handful of sort of basic lowest common denominator sort of cultural attitude questions that would people will lie, obviously, but the very fact of your asking the question sets down a marker. The Europeans have done some of the similar things. I think it was Denmark years ago had some, or maybe it was the Netherlands, had you know, a kind of a brochure about, you know, you want to move here? Here's some information for you, and showed pictures of, you know, women who weren't covered up, men holding hands, whatever it is. And I think that they were trying to send the signal, look, this is what we got here, and if you don't like it, maybe our country isn't for you. My point is just to be a little more proactive and explicit about that.
Sometimes someone asking a boy or a girl 4 years old, are you a terrorist? So that is understood.
Not for minors. I mean, minors, they come with their parents, and the parents are the ones who are asking the question. So.
Hi. Also for Mark, I appreciated Ira Strauss. I appreciated the objectivity of your presentation and the subtlety of it. I really appreciated that, and some comprehensiveness. This was really helpful. I might have had a substantive question, but I'm struck by the heckling you've received and the polemics. A lot of polemics, a lot of heckling, a lot of straw man polemic based on another speaker misstating what you said and then shooting it down as a straw man at some length. Does this often happen? Does it make it difficult to get a serious discussion which might proceed on the basis of the objective presentation you gave and that some others gave here, some others, in order to draw further conclusions instead of polemicizing against you, heckling you, putting you on the defensive? I would have liked to see a discussion proceed further. Do you often find difficulty in getting the discussion to proceed further? And I would like to add, I thank the Potomac Foundation for allowing you to speak at all. I think that's very helpful.
I wouldn't count this as heckling at all. You want to see heckling, you should come to other events. This is actually a really good audience, and this has been a good discussion. So no, I don't really have that problem, really. I mean, it's so.
We'll have one more question, please.
Hi, my name's Ron Taylor. I'm with George Washington University, a senior fellow there, and I promise I won't heckle or any of that other stuff. If I look at the title of the seminar, The Refugee Crisis, Humanitarian and Security Implications, what it brought to my mind is, you know, in today's modern world, shrinking world, complex environment, all that stuff, you know, what is the global community's responsibility for providing safety, security, and humanitarian relief when needed? I guess that's kind of it. What's the responsibility, and whose responsibility is it, and how do we do it, and on what time frame, and who helps, and all that? And so, you know, that's the question I kind of thought we're answering here, and I think you all did a good job, you know, kind of touching on pieces of that. And so, if I look back over 200 years history of the United States, and I kind of look at the map that has evolved around the globe during that time frame, whether I cut it every 50 years or 10 or 20 or whatever, one thing that strikes me as a phenomenon is that nations change. You know, they just change over a certain period of time. And it seems like with the advent of technology, with the changes in environment, whatever the cause is, they seem to have changed more frequently over more recent time frames. The Mideast is an example of that. Other parts of the world are an example. And migrant flows are changing as well. You know, you talked a lot about the flows coming up through Central America, but there's a lot of migration going from Africa to South America and up through Central America into the U.S. as well. So the patterns are changing. Syrians are going that way as well. And so, you know, the nation-state concept, and you talked about the responsibilities of the deals that were made with Turkey and who steps in and helps and how they help. The nation-state concept itself seems to be just every day evolving in a different way, so that there's a breakdown there. You know, who's responsible changes almost every day, and what organization changes almost every day. So the deals that are made one day don't seem to have much value anymore. And many of these other organizations seem to be more stable than nation-state kind of deals. So that's kind of one thing I wanted to just say. You can react to that. But really the thing I wanted to point out was a small note I saw on Mr. Stein's graph, which said, you know, corruption, and he had it next to combating crime. For me, corruption's the problem. In terms of providing safety, security, humanitarian relief, whether you want to throw money at it, you're going to run into corruption. Whether you want to provide safety for people, you're going to run into corruption. Whether you want to provide security, you're going to run into corruption. You're going to run into it at the lowest levels. You're going to run into it at government levels. You're going to run into it at nation-state levels. You're going to run into it at every level, and nobody talks about it. Everybody goes, that's just the way it is. We have to deal with it. As long as we deal with corruption, we will never solve any problem that has to do with safety, security, and humanitarian relief. That's my opinion. So corruption is number 1 on the list. It's not number 10. It's not a little thing. It is number 1. And so if you have a thought about that.
Okay, well, this requires another seminar.
Is that the next seminar?
Another one, don't worry, we'll get to it. Yeah, is there one more question?
A couple of ladies had a question.
Ladies?
Maybe they quit. Maybe they went home.
Oh, yes, please.
Yes, is there any way to pressure, have the international community pressure the Gulf states to give more than just money?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, it's not an international community. There is no such thing. In other words, will other countries pressure the Gulf states? I mean, you could, I suppose. We would be probably the ones most in a position to pressure them, but I don't think we have. If somebody knows more about it, I'm glad to hear it, but I don't think we've done that.
I know a little bit. So I think one of the issues with Gulf aid is that it's not very well integrated into the broader aid programs. So where other countries coordinate very closely with UNHCR, the other UN agencies, some of the Gulf countries do their own assistance programs. So for instance, when I was in Jordan and Lebanon trying to do interviews, they really didn't want to talk to us, right? So they're doing stuff, they're doing it on a bilateral basis with these countries, they're providing support to local NGOs, mainly faith-based NGOs, but it's not always plugged in and it's hard to measure because of that, so it's hard to know exactly what they're doing and where.
But you meant resettling people, in other words,
They're
pressuring
not-
them to, yeah, they're not doing
They're not going to do that.
And they're not going to do that.
They're not
yeah.
going to do that.
Because, you know, they see it as a security threat and what have you, so.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I guess we better wrap it up here. We're already, as usual, we're over our time frame before I get to talk, you know, and I don't know why you do that. I think, though, that it's really obvious that, you know, again, and I kind of end up saying this no matter what the seminar is all about, but you really need to strategize these kind of challenges. It's not, you know, it's not an economic challenge and all that. It's not just morality. It's not just a whole bunch of things. It's a combination of thoughts and thinking that has to go into it, and it has to be adaptive. It's a tough issue. In our great country, we were founded, as has been pointed out, on democratic principles and the like, and we believe in freedom, and we believe in the right to have others and to take care of people when we can. And we've done a great job with that through our history in all parts of the world. But one thing that was fundamental when I grew up, my grandparents on my mother's side came from Switzerland, and on my father's side they came from they were Scotch-Irish, and but when they came to this country and when they came through New York and through the harbor and the Statue of Liberty and all that kind of thing, they, like everybody else, they tried to assimilate into our culture, our country, our way of thinking. Sure, there were always there were Irish communities and there were German communities and other than the like, but they were all part of the greater American community. And one of the things that has bothered me in this whole immigration topic, if you will, is when you come to this country, you got to kind of learn to try to learn our ways and our cultures. And this culture thing is very crucial, and it's different in all these places around the world. With respect to the refugees and all of that kind of thing, it's tough. You gotta really it's just a tough decision to make. I was deeply involved in the refugees that came from Vietnam. I was involved in the evacuation. I was involved in the refugees that came down from from North Korea into South Korea in 1953, and every fourth or fifth one was a North Korean soldier who ended up trying to gun some of our people down. I've seen this kind of thing, and I remember in 1964, we had thousands and thousands and thousands of North Vietnamese came to South Vietnam, mainly Catholics that had been persecuted and the like. I was commanding the outpost by the Ben Hai River, the northernmost outpost in South Vietnam at the time, and my counterpart was a very good fighter, Colonel Yai, who I had known in earlier days in special operations, and we were close friends, and our orders were to stop these refugees. And he and I went down by the Ben Hai River alone, really. We were backed up with some people who had weapons trained and so on, but we went down there alone. And we decided that from the standpoint of being human, we would face these refugees and we would look at them and we'd let them come through. And that's what we did, and we violated the orders, and they came through, and nobody ever really said anything about it, or if they did, I never heard about it. But the point I want to make is these are decisions you make, and they're not easy. They're not easy. And I think the public health issue is crucial. We haven't talked an awful lot about that. When you evacuate refugees and the like with amphibious ships and Marines and the like, we have hospitals on our landing on our amphibious ships, and so you can take care of these kind of things. And we did that. We did that in Vietnam. We did it off Liberia. We did it in Mogadishu. We do it wherever we go. But it's not an easy issue, and so I think, again, like all our seminars, we really ought to have a month-long seminar in each one of these topics where we can really get at the issues. In terms of your point, I was simply to say that corruption's a way of life in most parts of the world, and we need to remember that. One of the reasons why in Southeast Asia and the Philippines and Indonesia that they so many of their sons and daughters are trained to be doctors is because there's a corruption angle there, and they all do that. So this is a way of life, and I don't condone it, nor do you, I know, but it is a way of life, and you have to learn to deal with it. You can't, there are no easy solutions. As my uncle once said, nothing good is easy. But anyway, thank you very much for being with us.